So in my last video I made this great new bench. It's super solid and there's tons of space up here for me to work. In fact, you can see me trying it out right now over on the main channel. But just because it's good doesn't mean it can't be better, right? What I think it needs is some accessories. And one thing that I've always wanted but never really had room for is some sort of drawing board. You see, I always like to start off my projects by sketching up some ideas. Working on a flat table is fine, but some kind of adjustable angle table would do wonders for my posture. I'd love to have one of those vast, over-engineered drafting tables, but I don't have space in here for something like that. And I'm not going to try to retrofit this benchtop to tilt, mainly because it weighs like 100 pounds. Now, I've seen those folding desktop easels, but the last thing I need is something else cluttering up the top of the bench. But if I don't want it on the top of the bench, then why not on the bottom? What if I could make some sort of drafting board that lives under the benchtop instead of on top of it? This piece of foam core is about the right size, I'd say. What if I could figure out a way for it to slide out and lock into place when I need it, then slide it back when I'm done? And not just stored under there, but literally integrated into the bench. It would need to be reasonably rigid, and adjustable for different angles would be good too. I have a few ideas, but I think I need to head down to the workshop to do some prototyping. To start, I need to mock up a bench top. Conveniently, I happen to have a chunk of bench right here. This piece of plywood will represent the two main actions of the drawing board, sliding in and out, and bending up into position. In order to achieve that bending action, I'm thinking it'll need a hinge. Here's a slightly thicker piece of plywood which is connected to a smaller tailpiece with a basic barrel hinge. I'm thinking the tailpiece will somehow need to stay under the bench top while the other parts swing up. It hits the edge of the bench when it's upright, but I think I can actually use that to my advantage. How far out the tailpiece extends changes the angle of the drawing board, and the edge of the bench could be what holds it up. But to do that, I'll need some sort of support system. I'm thinking a pair of rails made with a spacer and a runner will do the trick. I'll just put those together quickly with some screws. Wow, that was quick. Gotta love editing. Anyway, I'll flip the top to get those screwed onto the underside. And a piece of veneer makes for a good spacer to leave a bit of clearance. Okay, let's try that out. Sliding action, confirmed. How about bendage? Yes, it bends. It's a bit wobbly though, as I had to leave clearance for the hinge. But I don't need clearance behind the hinge, so I'll slap on a riser block with a bit of the old cyanoacrylate, aka superglue. It's great for putting stuff together in a hurry like this. That's a bit of a better fit. Still not super snug, but close enough for a proof of concept. And you can see that if I hold the bottom in place, the top is pretty well supported by the edge of the bench. But I can't just keep one hand on the thing all the time. I need some way to keep it from sliding back and forth. But what if I can rig some sort of latch on the back here? I could add a piece of wood that can move freely up and down like this. That way it could drop into some notches in the rails. That could work. To do that, I need to make a couple of slots in this piece. I'll put a pair of holes at each end to define the ends of each slot, and I'm going to use a countersink bit to accommodate the type of screws that I have handy. I'll just use a chisel to remove the waste in between the holes to finish the slots. And I'll extend that countersink as well. Hopefully with a screw in there you can see where I'm going with this. With the slots done, I'll mark where the screws need to go. I need to get the spacing right or else the bar won't move freely. Even so, it's still too tight. It needs to be able to drop just under its own weight. I can widen the slots a little, but I don't want them to be too big either. I think the threads on the screws might be grabbing, so I'll file those down a bit too. Okay, not perfect, but good enough for testing. The notches should be easier. I'll just mark those to be slightly wider than the thickness of the bar, and then I'll cut them out with a saw and chisel. And hey, it works. Gravity for the win. Let's flip this thing over and give it a test drive. Alright, it's engaged all on its own. And hey, look at that. It stays up. Pretty solid too. Look at how the bench top is moving. There's a bit of wobble if I push down here, but I can work on that. Now let's see if it'll go back in. Yeah, the 1-inch legs on my demo bench aren't quite cutting it. Okay, one more time for good luck. Yep, it totally works. On to the drawing board. I decided to go with 1/2-inch birch plywood for the main body. It's strong and stable, so it should be a good choice. I cut a piece 24 inches wide and 30 inches long, and then I rip a strip 6 inches wide for the tail piece, leaving a piece that's 18 by 30 for the main board. I'll give that a light sanding, as I want to give it an initial coat of finish now. Oh, and you might notice that it's got a warp in it that I didn't notice when I bought it. I only saw it now, but I figure it won't be a deal breaker in this case. I'm going to go with a water-based polyurethane finish, both because it's tough and it's what I've got.
Oh my god.
Turns out it's pretty old too. It's turned into forbidden yogurt. Well, it's water-based after all, so I'll mix in some water to see if I can rescue it. If I can't, it's trash, so there's nothing to lose anyway. Still pretty thick, but usable, I think. Hopefully it'll still dry properly. I'll just brush it on and do my best to spread it out in an even coat. All in all, doesn't seem too bad, actually. While that's drying, I'll mill up some wood for the rails and trim. I'm going with maple for the rails, as it's both strong and even-grained. This first piece will be for the spacers, and I'm cutting it down to a nice chunky 1-inch by 1 inch. And yes, I did marble one of my push sticks. The runners are thinner and wider, about 1.5 inches wide by 1/2 inch thick. Lastly, I planed down some cherry to match the 1/2 inch thickness of the plywood. The runners get cut to length, or in this case, miscut to length. Stay tuned for more on that. The length of the spacers is less critical, so no mistakes there. To rip the thin strips for the trim, I set up a stop block well back of the blade on the left. After each pass, I move the fence over for the next cut. That way, I always have the wider part of the board between the blade and the fence. Back at the bench, we can get an idea how all these pieces are going to go together. The tail piece goes along the main drawing board and will be attached with a long piano hinge. The runners and spacers will make up the rails on either side. Another piece of plywood will pad out the tail piece, and I cut a piece of oak 3/8 of an inch thick and 1 inch wide for the drop bar. I'll also pad out the hinge area a bit with some strips to give a bit more thickness so I can use some longer screws. And then finally the cherry strips will get glued around the outside to cover up the plywood. Okay, that's the plan. I think first I'll make the notches in the runners to accept the drop bar. To work out the spacing for those, I made up a full-scale drawing of the mechanism in side view. Here I've laid out a variety of angles for the board. From there I drew in the hinge assembly and then measured back under the bench top 6 inches from each position, which is the width of the tailpiece. That gave me these 5 notch locations, which I can now transfer onto the runners. To make sure both the left and right runners are the same, I'll tape the two together and then cut the notches on the table saw with a sled. I set the depth of the cut, including the thickness of the tape, though if it was a bit too deep it wouldn't matter, as that part of the runner will be underneath the spacer anyway. You can't really tell here, but what I'm doing is looking straight down at my line as I advance the sled up to the blade. Just before it makes contact, I can adjust the position of the wood if necessary, and that way I can make the cut right on the line. The profile of the crosscut blade does leave an uneven surface on the bottom of the notches, but that's easily cleaned up with a chisel before the runners get separated. And testing the fit, it looks good, loose enough to move freely, but not sloppy. I do have some concern though about some of these smaller fingers. The lateral force on the long grain could snap them off, so I'm going to give those some reinforcement. To do that, I'll install some screws into these two squarish ones, and then in this little one I'll pre-drill and insert a small nail. That way each of them will have a steel backbone, which should be more than strong enough for my purposes. Here I'm breaking out my big hammer again, this time for a more appropriately sized job though. I'll pre-drill and countersink for the screws, and as an added measure I'll enlarge those holes a bit, as I don't want the force of the screws to crack these small tabs. To that end, I'll put the screws in by hand so I don't over-tighten them. Okay, I still think it's functional as intended. How about we say this is a prototype? That way there are no mistakes, just design anomalies. Yeah, slide out drawing board, mark 1. To attach the runners to the spacers, I just lay out the locations for some countersunk screws. I won't glue these together in case I decide to remake the runners for no specific reason. While I'm at it, I'll also pre-drill some mounting holes for when I get it installed later. So if I break out my test piece, you can see that the notches seem to be working. But here's that design anomaly from earlier. When I cut the runners, I failed to take into account the full length of the board plus the tailpiece. That means that the drop bar will do its thing way back here under the bench, effectively locking it in the stowed position. To fix that, I decided that some tapered extensions would work to raise the drop bar back up as the whole assembly gets pulled out. My clever viewers probably realize that this is an overly complicated solution, as a longer runner would keep the drop bar from dropping down in the first place. But I didn't realize that at the time, so this is the solution that I went with. Back at the saw, I use an existing wedge as a quick jig to slice off one tapered piece. And then I take the wedge out and a straight cut will yield another one. The CA glue should be more than enough to keep these in place, as they won't need to really bear any weight, they just need to stay put. Using the activator spray makes the bond more or less instantaneous. Then those extension subassemblies get glued and clamped on the underside of the runners. Now's a good time to glue the riser to the tailpiece. With good glue coverage and plenty of clamps, that's not going anywhere. Except over here, where it's not in my way. A bit later, those are dry, so I'll get them out of the clamps and fine-tune those wedges so that the drop bar doesn't catch on them in either direction. For the edge strips, I'll just mark the length for the first piece and then cut it to size with a saw and a miter box, though I'm not actually mitering the corners. Butt joints are good enough here. And for small stuff like this, cutting it by hand is just as fast as with a power tool, and much quieter. To make my life easier, I'll put the board upright in the vise, and my little test block makes for a handy spacer to keep the jaw of the vise from racking. For now, I'm putting the trim on with just wood glue and some edge clamps. When I run out of those, though, some F-clamps and wedges achieve the same thing. While I'm gluing, I put the backing strip on the tailpiece. Earlier I had some plywood cut for this purpose, but it was a bit too thin, so I switched it out for some 1/4-inch pine. It's just there to give some extra material for the screws to grab into, so the material itself isn't critical. I left that strip long for some reason, so I'll just trim it to length with a handsaw. I used this trick on the bench build and I quite like it. By applying the finish first, any glue squeezed out will just flake off easily. And I'll break out the card scraper again to bring the edge down flush, as well as take care of any remaining glue. Everyone seemed to like the scraper in the last video, so I thought it only right to give it an encore. I decided that here on the hinge side I would add a wider bit of trim that will become a pencil rest when the drawing board is set up. It needs to protrude downward in order to be in the right position when the board's upright, and in order for it to pass between the runners, I'll need to cut it back on the ends. It only needs to clear the little protruding bit, but since it'll be very visible, I'm going to finish the cut with a bit of a curve. It's a bit overkill for just these, but I wanted to introduce you to my old 1940s era Walker Turner bandsaw. It's a rattly old beast that I quite literally picked up off a trash heap in a garbage dump. But I got it up and running again, and it has served me well for years now. Come to think of it, my wife says the exact same thing about me. Anyway, the bandsaw leaves some fairly rough cuts, so I just refine those a bit on the sander, and then I get the pencil rest installed like the rest of the trim with glue and clamps. The tail assembly also gets some trim, but in this case it's just to match the width of the drawing board. Without it, the tailpiece would be too loose when the board's set up. While those dry, I can get to work on the drop bar. I wasn't totally satisfied with my test prototype, specifically with the tapered screws. For the Mark I model, I'm going to use these pocket hole screws, which not only have a wide flat head that won't require a countersink, but they also have this long shank without any threads, which I hope will run more smoothly in the slots. I also want to up the precision this time, so I take my time to mark out my hole positions before drilling them out. And instead of chiseling out the waste, this time I'll use a fret saw to cut right along my layout lines. Right, I think that's going to work pretty well. The glue's dry on the pencil rest, so I can now attach the other backing strip for the hinge. Looking back on it now, I should have made the pencil rest a little bit wider to hide the backing strip when the board's set up, but that's something to note for the Mark II model. And a final strip is added to the top of the drawing board. I made this one a bit wider, as this is the edge that will be showing when the board is stowed away, so I want it to fill the gap under the bench a little bit more. Back to the drop bar now. Sorry if I seem to be all over the place here. It's important I get the screw positions correct, otherwise the bar will bind against them. Naturally, the drill bit wandered in the plywood and did exactly what I was trying to avoid. No harm though, I just drilled it wider, glued in a bit of dowel, then marked and re-drilled the hole. No harm done. Even so, the fit is still pretty tight, so I used a small file to refine the slots a bit until I got the bar moving freely. The glue's dry on all the trim now, but for the top and bottom edges I want to add some mechanical attachment. These areas will get pulled on from time to time, so I'm going to install some small brass screws. These will add a nice visual touch, as well as serving to keep the trim attached. In fact, I like the look so much, I went ahead and added the screws on all four sides. It's finally time to get that piano hinge installed. In the past, I found these a bit tricky to install. If it's not put on perfectly square, the two sides will get out of alignment when it's opened up. With the drawing board weighed down to stop it from shifting, I mark out a few of the screw locations first, just enough to test the operation and make sure it looks good. I use a piece of scrap as a quick depth stop so I don't drill through the face of the board. With 8 screws installed, I can test the action. And that looks perfect, so I'll put the rest in. The screw heads are actually hitting each other and keeping it from opening all the way, which I've always thought is a bit of a design flaw with these hinges. But it probably won't ever open that far in use, and if it does, I can just take out the alternating screws to allow clearance. So with all the parts assembled, I guess it's time to do some quality control. The tapered riser on this side is doing its job nicely. Not so much for the other one though. Same goes for that drop bar. It's not moving quite freely enough. It'll sometimes fall into place, but not reliably. So it looks like I need to do a little fine tuning. I'll start by beveling the bottom edges of the drop bar. Hopefully that will encourage it to both catch the edge of the risers as well as fall down into the notches. And speaking of those, I'll give them a slight bevel as well. Just a small one. I can always increase it later if necessary. A few passes with the block plane will hopefully bring that riser down enough for the bar to slide up over it. Looks like that did the trick. Now let's try out the drop bar. That's looking good. Now I just need to disassemble everything to give it a couple coats of finish. I'll give it a light sanding, mainly to take any sharp corners off the trim. Then I'll clean off the dust and put on the finish. The back gets one coat, while the front and all the trim gets two. And if you're wondering, I don't think rehydrating the finish had any downside on it at all. So I'm glad that worked out. Once that's all nice and dry, I can get all the hardware put back in place, which is a breeze compared to when I first did it. And with everything put back together, it's time to cart it out to the bindery and get it installed. First thing first, I'll attach the right-hand rail, making sure that it's square to the front of the bench. I'm leaving a gap on the right side in case I want to add a little tool drawer or something in the future. I want to set the rail back from the edge a little bit, so I'll just use a couple of pieces of wood that I had on hand as a gauge, because I can't really see what I'm doing way over there on that side. I'll then use the drill just to mark the location where I need to make a pilot hole in the bench top. I'm using a countersink bit here, not because I'm going to countersink the hole, but because the shank of the bit is the right length for the pilot hole. I'll confirm everything's square and then put in the second screw before marking and drilling the third one. It's a bit of an extra step, but this way I know I won't get the holes out of alignment. I'll use the drawing board itself to position the second rail, with a piece of heavy paper as a shim to allow for a bit of clearance. Then I'll get it screwed down the same as the first one. That's it for the power tools. Now I just need to get this thing flipped back into place. With any luck, I can now get the board tucked in. The drop bar seems to be working, that's for sure. Fits perfect. Now for the real test. Let's see if it works as intended. That's position 1 locked in, and it looks like I goofed on the measurement there. It's binding against the front of the bench here. Oh well, let's try position 2. Yeah, that's pretty good. Feels pretty sturdy too. The middle position looks good as well. We're on a roll now. Position 4 is looking a little bit less stable, but not unusable. And it seems pretty sturdy under weight, which I was more concerned for with these lower angles. Yeah, I think the 5th spot is a no-go. The tailpiece is pulled out too far and is rotating out of place. I don't think this configuration is going to get much use. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. It's got 3 very usable positions, and it's more than enough space for a large sketch pad. I can sit here and draw to my heart's content, no problem at all. And what's more, if the bench is all cluttered up and I need to do some quick brainstorming, I don't need to move a thing. What, did you think I was going to paint a masterpiece here or something? Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through all this. It was a bit of an experiment, so I'm pleased it turned out as well as it did. It's got a few things that could be improved upon, but I think overall it's a sound design, so making improvements is just part of the process. It was a lot of fun to make, so I hope you enjoyed following along. That's it for now. Cheers. See you next time.